Get up there then, sit on it like a horse, they can't touch you. That was the first thing I heard him say, and I have thought about it every day since. I was standing maybe 30 feet from the old gun when he said it, close enough to see the shine come up in his eyes, and I knew the way you know weather is turning that something was about to go wrong on that forecourt. I had come for a quiet morning. I left with a story I have told more carefully than any other I own. My name does not matter much to this. I am a man who worked stone for 40 years before my knees retired me, and I had brought my grandson to see the palace and the changing of the guard, because the boy is at the age where he believes nothing his grandfather tells him until he sees it. We had got there early. We had a good place at the rope, the boy up on the low wall behind us, and in front of us the wide gray apron of cobble that runs from the gates to the inner court. And there, off to one side where the cobble meets the lawn, stood the old siege gun. You have seen guns like it. A long bronze barrel on the green-brown of a coin you find in the dirt, set on a carriage of dark oak and iron, the wheels taller than a man's waist. There is a small brass plate bolted to the carriage, and the plate says in letters worn nearly smooth that the gun was cast in a year 3 centuries gone, and that it stood at a siege whose name the boy could not pronounce. It is not a toy. It is not a bench. It is the kind of object you lower your voice near without quite knowing why. And 6 feet from it, at his post inside a painted box of stone, stood the guard. I want to describe him plainly because everything that happened turns on him, and because the way the cameras later told it made him a statue and a saint, and he was neither. He was a young man in a red tunic with brass buttons down the front, a tall black bearskin pulled low to his brow, white gloves, a rifle held at his side, his boots like 2 black mirrors. His chin strap cut a line under his lip. He looked straight ahead at nothing, and he did not move. Not his eyes, not his hands, not the line of his shoulders. The crowd flowed and pointed and held up phones, and he stood in the middle of all of it as still as the gun beside him, and I remember thinking that the gun and the man were a matched pair. 2 things put there to be looked at and not climbed. The young man who would climb it came late, the way that kind always does, pushing up through the soft crowd with the certainty of a man who has never once been told to wait. He was perhaps in his late 20s, dressed expensively and carelessly, a phone in his hand the whole time, and around him moved 3 or 4 others who laughed before he finished his sentences. I marked him the moment he arrived because he was loud in a place that had gone quiet, and because he stopped in front of the old gun, tilted his head at it, and said the thing I started this with. Get up there then, sit on it like a horse, they can't touch you. One of his friends laughed and said something about the rope, about whether it was allowed. He waved that away. Allowed, he said, like the word tasted of nothing. Who's going to stop me, him? And he jerked his thumb at the guard without looking at him, the way you'd point at a lamppost. I felt my grandson's hand tighten on my shoulder. The boy is sharp. He had already understood before I had that we were watching the beginning of something and not the end of it. The young man swung a leg up onto the carriage. The oak is high and he had to scramble graceless, his expensive shoes scraping the iron, and his friends cheered him on and lifted their phones, and he got one knee onto the carriage and then hauled himself up so that he was sitting astride the long bronze barrel of a 300-year-old gun as if it were a fairground ride. He grinned down. He held up a hand. The phones turned to face him. And the guard turned his head. I had been watching the man on the gun like everyone else, so I nearly missed it, and I am glad I did not because it was the first true thing I saw that morning. The guard did not shout. He did not step from his box. He turned his head a precise quarter, the bearskin tipping, and he looked at the man on the gun with a flat, level steadiness that had no anger in it at all. It was the look a stonemason gives a crack in a wall, measuring, certain, already deciding what the wall is going to do. Then, in a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to and not 1 inch farther, he said 5 words. Sir, step down, that's an order. I have heard men give orders. I gave a few myself on the sights, when a young lad was about to put his hand somewhere a hand should not go. There is a particular flatness to a real one, a refusal to plead or to threaten, that comes only from a man who has given the order many times and watched it obeyed. That was the flatness in his voice. It was not a request, and it was not a fight. It was a fact arriving a little ahead of its consequences. The man on the gun laughed. "Hawks," he said to the phones, delighted. "Did you get that? He talks." And he settled himself more comfortably astride the barrel, leaned back on one hand as if for the camera, and looked down at the guard with the lazy contempt of a man who has decided another man is furniture. "Relax, soldier. It's a statue. You're a statue. We're all just having a nice day." He lifted his phone and turned it so the lens caught them both, himself up high, the guard down small, the joke he thought he was making. The guard had already turned his face forward again. That, I think, is the part the crowd misread in the moment, and the part that mattered most. He had given the order. The order stood. He was not going to give it twice, and he was not going to be drawn into the performance the young man wanted, because the young man wanted exactly that: a guard who shouts, who reddens, who climbs out of his box and becomes, for the watching phones, the second clown in the act. The guard would not be the second clown. So he faced front, motionless, and let the order hang there in the air over the cobbles, true and unanswered, and the silence of it was worse for the man on the gun than any shouting would have been. I watched the grin on the young man's face go a little uncertain at the edges. He had expected a scene. He had been handed a wall instead. His friends felt it too. One of them said quietly, "Now, maybe come down, yeah." And another laughed, but it was the laugh you give to cover a thing that has stopped being funny. The phones were still up. But the air on that forecourt had changed. The way it does just before a stone you have been easing out of a wall finally decides to come. And I put my hand back over my grandson's hand on my shoulder. And I waited, because I knew now, the way I knew the weather, that the man on the gun was not going to come down quietly, and that when he came down it would not be on his own terms at all. For a moment I thought I was wrong. For a moment it looked as though the friends would win, would coax him down, would turn the whole thing into a clip they could laugh about over a drink that night and forget by the week's end. The young man slid one foot down toward the carriage. The crowd around me let out a small breath, and then someone in his group, I never saw which, said the words that undid all of it. "Don't let him win, though." It is astonishing how small the hinge can be. The guard had not been trying to win anything. He was a man standing where he had been told to stand, doing the one thing he had been trained to do, which was to be the fixed point in a moving world. There was no contest. But the young man heard the word win, and you could see it land in him, see the pride flush up his neck, and he pulled his foot back onto the barrel and sat up straight again, and the uncertainty went out of his face and was replaced by something harder. "He hasn't won anything," he said. "He can't do anything, that's the whole point of him, he just stands there." He looked down at the guard with real spite now, the spite of a man who has been made for 30 seconds to feel small in front of an audience and has decided to make someone pay for it. Hey, toy soldier, look at me." The guard did not look. "Look at me when I'm up here, take my picture, go on, salute. Do a little salute for the camera." And here is a thing I have turned over many times since. The guard's discipline in that moment was not weakness, and it was not even patience exactly. It was a kind of mercy that the young man was too foolish to recognize, because the guard had every authority on that forecourt to escalate, to summon, to end the man's mourning with a word, and instead he simply held, giving the fool every last second to climb down on his own and walk away with nothing worse than a story about the day he sat on a cannon. The stillness was the off-ramp. The young man kept driving past it. "Nothing," the young man crowed. "See, nothing." He turned to the phones. "This is the most disciplined man in the country, and he can't even make me get off a gun. Tax money well spent." It was then that I saw the sergeant. He came from the direction of the inner court, unhurried, an older man with a weathered face and a peaked cap, and the kind of bearing that makes a crowd part without being asked. He was not running. I have noticed that the men who are genuinely in charge of a situation almost never run. He walked the length of the cobble at an even pace, and as he came I saw two things at once: that the young man on the gun had not yet noticed him, and that the guard at the post the guard's eyes had flicked once, the smallest acknowledgement, and then gone forward again, because the situation was passing into other hands, and his job was to remain exactly what he had been the whole time. The sergeant stopped at the foot of the carriage. He looked up at the young man with an expression of enormous, settled patience, the look of a man who has removed a great many people from a great many places they should not have been. "Good morning," the sergeant said. "You're going to come down now." "Or what?" said the young man, but there was a hairline crack in it now. The sergeant was not part of the joke. The sergeant was a different kind of object than the silent guard, and some animal part of the young man recognized it. "Or this becomes a different morning than the one you wanted," the sergeant said pleasantly. "That gun is 300 years old. It is not a chair, and it is not yours, and the carriage you're sitting on has cracked oak that this household has spent more than you'd believe keeping sound. You've had your picture. Come down, give the gentleman behind you back his footpath, and we'll all get on with the day." For one breath I thought it would work. The young man looked at the sergeant, looked at the phones, looked, and this was the tell, at his friends, to see whether climbing down now would cost him more than staying up. And his friends had gone quiet, which should have told him the audience had already turned, that the clip they were filming was no longer the clip he imagined, that he had become the fool in it and not the hero. But a certain kind of man cannot read that, because reading it would mean admitting he had misjudged the room, and he would rather break something than admit that. So he stayed on the gun, and he looked back down at the sergeant, and he reached for the worst thing he had. "Make me," he said. The sergeant did not rise to it. He turned his head a fraction and spoke low to the guard at the post, not a shout, just a word passed between two professionals, and I understood, watching, that some line had just been crossed in the careful arithmetic these men carry in their heads, the line between a nuisance to be waited out and a matter to be closed. The guard came to attention with a single crisp movement that made the whole crowd flinch, the rifle shifting, the boots ringing once on the stone, and he took one measured step out of his painted box. He did not lunge, he did not climb. He simply repositioned himself with that terrible economy to stand between the gun and the open forecourt, so that when the man came down, and he was going to come down now, one way or another, he would come down into a space that was controlled. It was the most disciplined thing I had yet seen, and the young man for the first time looked genuinely uncertain, because the wall he had been mocking had just demonstrated without a raised voice that it could move when it chose to, and that the choosing was not his. "Last time," the sergeant said, "down now." And the young man, cornered by his own pride with the whole forecourt watching, did the thing that turned a foolish morning into a criminal one. He swung himself off the barrel, not down the carriage, but out, jumping clumsily to the cobbles right in front of the guard, and as he landed, off balance and furious and humiliated, he put both hands flat on the guard's chest and shoved him, hard, in front of every phone on the forecourt. I have replayed the next 2 seconds more times than I can count, because they are the whole of the matter, and because they are the opposite of everything the young man expected to happen. He had shoved the guard expecting one of two outcomes. Either the guard would stagger and look foolish, a statue tipped over, a clip to laugh at, or the guard would lose his composure and shove back, swing, react, and become a man brawling with a tourist, a man who could be filmed and blamed and turned into the villain of the story. The young man wanted badly for it to be a fight, because in a fight nobody is innocent and everybody is just two men shoving, and he could live with that. The guard gave him neither. He did not stagger. The shove landed on a body that was braced and rooted in a way the young man's had never been in his life, and the guard rocked back perhaps 2 inches and came forward again onto his stance like a door swinging shut, and his face did not change. And he did not strike back. His gloved hands stayed exactly where they were, one at his side, one at the rifle. I was close enough to see the muscle move in his jaw, the only sign, the single human flicker, of a man holding back something with his whole strength. And then even that was gone, and he simply stood, having been assaulted, having every right and provocation, and chose, in front of all of us, to remain the wall. It was the most extraordinary act of strength I have ever watched a man perform, and not one camera understood it in the moment. They thought they had filmed nothing. They had filmed everything. Because the shove was the line. The sergeant had been waiting for the young man to define his own morning, and the young man had just defined it, with both hands on camera. The sergeant moved, and now he moved quickly, but it was the controlled quickness of a man closing a gate, no wasted motion. And he had the young man by the upper arm before the fool had even finished enjoying his own gesture. "You've just assaulted a soldier on duty," the sergeant said, and his voice had changed. The patience was gone out of it, and something colder and more final had taken its place. "In front of about 200 phones. You're not going anywhere." "I barely touched him," the young man said, and the whine of it, the sudden child in his voice, made my grandson lean down to my ear and whisper, "He's scared now." The boy was right. The certainty had drained out of the young man so fast it was almost pitiable. It was a joke, it was a get off me. Do you know who I don't," said the sergeant, "and it will not help you." 2 more men had come from the inner court, quiet and quick, and they did not rough him, did not so much as raise their voices, but they closed around him with the unhurried competence of men who do this and have always done this, and the young man's friends melted backward into the crowd, the way friends of that kind always do the instant there is a cost to standing near him. One of them was still holding up a phone. I remember thinking, "You will regret that recording more than anything you have ever filmed." They walked him off the forecourt. He went loudly at first, protesting, threatening, naming a lawyer, naming money, naming the vague important people that men like that always have just out of frame. And then, as the gates of the inner court closed behind him and the cobbles emptied of his audience, he went quiet, because the audience was the whole of his power and the household had just taken it away from him by the simple act of walking him out of view. A man like that, off camera, with no one laughing, is nothing at all. I think that was the first true thing he learned that morning, though I doubt it was the last. The sergeant came back, after a few minutes, to the foot of the gun, and he did a thing I did not expect. He looked up at the old bronze barrel, at the cracked oak of the carriage, the way a man looks at a thing he is responsible for, and he laid one hand flat on the wheel of it briefly, almost gently. Then he turned and looked at the guard at the post, a long, level look between 2 men who had just been through something together, and he said one word quietly that I was close enough to hear. "Well stood." That was all. Well stood. And the guard, who had not moved through any of it, did not move now either. But I would swear on my 40 years of stone that something eased in the set of his shoulders, the way a beam settles when the load it was built to carry finally comes to rest on it true. I learned later what those 2 words meant in that household, the weight they carried. It is not a thing the men say lightly. To be told well stood by a sergeant of that watch, in front of a crowd, after holding your post through an assault without breaking, that is the whole of the reward, and the men who earn it know it is worth more than any medal you could pin on the red wool. The guard had been struck and shamed in front of 200 phones. He had answered with stillness. And the only voice on that forecourt whose opinion he had been raised to care about had told him, in 2 words, that he had done it exactly right. I do not think the young man, in his whole loud life, had ever once been told a true thing as plainly, or earned a thing as cleanly, as the guard earned those 2 words by doing nothing at all. And the guard had already gone back into his box. That is the detail I tell people who were not there, and it is the detail that none of them believe until I make them understand it. While the sergeant was taking the man's arm, while the friends were scattering, while 200 people were lowering their phones and turning to one another with that particular bright shock of having seen something, the guard had simply stepped back into his painted square of stone, brought himself to his post, settled the rifle, and resumed looking at nothing. His chest, where the man's hands had struck him, showed 2 faint smudges on the red wool where the gloves had not been quite clean. That was the only mark on him. He stood there with the smudges on his tunic and his eyes forward and the whole forecourt staring, and he did not acknowledge any of it, did not glance after the man, did not let his gaze drop to the marks, did not so much as shift his weight. He had been provoked, mocked, ordered, and assaulted, and in the space of 4 minutes he had answered all of it by becoming again exactly what he had been before any of it started. I have spent my life with materials that men test. You lean on a beam to see if it gives. You strike a stone to hear whether it rings true or dull. And I will tell you that I have rarely in my life seen anything ring as true as that young guardsman did when he was struck. He gave back nothing and he gave away nothing, and the truth of him was in the not giving. My grandson did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "Why didn't he hit him?" And there was real distress in it, the distress of a boy who had wanted, for one fierce second, to see the bully knocked flat, because that is the justice a boy understands. And I tried to find the words, standing there on the cobble with the gun beside us in the empty box where the man had been, and what I finally said was the closest I have ever come to it. I said, because hitting him was what the man wanted, and a strong man doesn't give a fool what the fool wants, he gives him what he's earned. The boy frowned at that, the way he frowns at everything I tell him, filing it away to disbelieve until he sees it proved. I think it was proved soon enough. We did not leave right away. There is a thing that happens to a crowd after a moment like that. It does not disperse, it gathers. People who had not seen the start drifted in to hear it from people who had. A woman near us was already showing her video to a stranger. The two of them bent over the bright little screen, and I heard the small tinny replay of the guard's voice, "Sir, step down." That's an order, and then the shove, and then the gasp of the woman who had been filming, all of it captured and kept. By the time we walked back toward the gates, I had seen the same 4 minutes replayed on a dozen phones from a dozen angles, and I understood that the young man had been wrong about one more thing. He had thought the cameras were his. He had performed for them, climbed for them, mocked for them, shoved for them. And the cameras had turned out to belong to everyone but him. I want to set down, before I go on, the thing the crowd did in those minutes, because it has stayed with me as much as anything the guard did. A crowd is a fickle animal. I have seen crowds turn cruel for less than a shove, have seen them egg a fool on, have seen 100 phones lifted to film a thing precisely because it was shameful and they wanted a piece of the shame. I had half expected that here. I had expected, when the man jumped down and pushed the guard, that some part of the crowd would laugh, would side with the spectacle, would treat the whole thing as the entertainment the young man had been so sure it was. They did not. The forecourt in the second after the shove made a single sound, a sharp, collective intake of breath, 200 people drawing the same breath at the same instant, and then it went quiet in a way that was not the quiet of fear but the quiet of judgment. I felt it pass through the people around me like a current. The woman beside me, who had been smiling at the antics a moment before, put her hand to her mouth. A man behind me said, low and disgusted, "Did you see that? He pushed him." He actually pushed him. And another voice answered, "On camera. The idiot did it on camera." There was no laughter anywhere near me. The young man had badly misjudged not only the guard but the crowd, who had come to that forecourt to see discipline and honor on display, and did not take kindly to watching a rich fool spit on it. That was the moment, I think, that the young man's morning was truly decided, not by the sergeant's hand on his arm, but by 200 ordinary people deciding, all at once and without a word among them, whose side they were on. And they were not on his. They had watched a man stand still under abuse, and they had understood the stillness, and a crowd that understands the stillness will not forgive the hand that strikes it. My grandson tugged at my sleeve. "Granddad," he said, "everyone's filming, everyone." And so they were, but not the way the young man had wanted. They were filming the way honest people film a thing they want kept and witnessed and answered for. The lenses that had come up to laugh at a guard had stayed up to convict a fool. I have thought since that the young man's deepest mistake was a kind of theological one. He believed the camera served him. He had never once considered that the same camera, turned by enough honest hands, becomes the most patient witness there is. A steward at the gate, a calm young woman in a dark coat, was quietly asking the people who had filmed the clearest footage whether they would be willing to share it, taking down details with the unsurprised efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew exactly what the footage was worth. Not for a website, for a file. I gave her my name and my grandson's account of what he'd seen from the wall, and she thanked us both with a gravity that told me this was not going to blow over by the weekend. "It helps," she said, "when ordinary people are willing to say what they saw." I told her we were willing. I have never been more willing of anything. What happened to the young man, I learned over the following days the way everyone learned it, in pieces, the pieces fitting together into something larger and more satisfying than any single shove on a forecourt. The first piece was the video itself, which by that evening had been watched more times than the population of the city, and which had, in the watching, performed a small miracle of clarity. People who had never given the guard a second thought, who had walked past men like him 100 times and seen only a costume and a posture, watched 4 minutes of footage and understood, suddenly and all at once, what the stillness was for. The comments, when I made my grandson read some of them to me, were not what I expected. I had braced for cruelty, for the usual ugliness. Instead, over and over in a dozen ways, people were saying the same thing the boy had asked me on the cobbles, and then answering it themselves. Why didn't he hit him? Because he didn't have to. Because not hitting him was the harder and the bigger thing. Because the man on the gun lost the moment he climbed up, and lost worse every second the guard refused to play. The young man had wanted to be seen. He got his wish. He was seen by everyone, and what they saw was not what he had hoped to show them. The second piece was who he was, and this is where I will be careful, because the lesson is not in his name, and I am not going to pretend I am sure of details I only heard second-hand. He was, it turned out, a young man of some money and no particular accomplishment, the kind who had built a small following by being loud and careless in public places, treating the world as a stage set put there for his use, filming himself doing things ordinary people had the decency not to do. The cannon was to have been another such trophy. Look where I sat, look what I got away with. He had a history of it, people said, other monuments, other rules, other small acts of contempt for things older and better than himself, each one filmed, each one a little brick in the little wall of his fame. He had never once been made to answer for any of it. The world had let him climb on everything he pleased. The Forecourt did not. Because the third piece, the one that mattered, the one the steward in the dark coat had been quietly assembling at the gate while the young man was still loudly naming his lawyer, was that this time there was a charge. Not a stern word, not a banning, not a fine he could pay out of pocket and forget. He had laid both hands on a soldier at his post and pushed him, and that is not a prank and it is not a gray area, and it does not matter at all how famous you think you are when you do it. It is an assault, and the household which could have let it go, which in another year and another mood might have decided the embarrassment of the video was punishment enough, did not let it go. They had 200 witnesses and 40 angles and a steward with a folder of names, and they pressed it, every step, with the same unhurried competence the sergeant had shown taking the man's arm. I was asked to attend in the end. So was my grandson, though because of his age he was not called to speak, only to sit with me at the back of a plain room with pale walls and hard chairs while the matter was heard. I had never been in such a room. I had expected, I think, drama, shouting, accusation, the sort of thing the young man himself would have staged. There was none of it. It was quieter than the forecourt had been, and it was, in its quietness, the most complete humbling of a man that I have ever watched. They played the video. They played it on a screen at the front of the room, and they played it whole. From the moment he stopped in front of the gun to the moment the sergeant walked him out of frame. And here is what I had not understood until I watched it played in that silent room with the man himself sitting 10 feet from me. The video was not on his side, and it was never going to be, because the camera is honest in a way the man had counted on it not being. He had lived his whole loud life trusting the camera to flatter him, to make his contempt look like confidence and his cruelty look like fun. But a camera only flatters you when you control what it points at and when it stops. This camera, these 40 cameras, had kept running past the part he liked, into the part he did not, and they showed, with a clarity no testimony could have matched, a young man climbing onto a thing he had been politely told 3 times not to climb, mocking a man who would not mock back, and finally, having run out of every other way to feel large, putting both hands on that man's chest and shoving him. There was no version of those 4 minutes in which he was anything but exactly what he was. I watched his face while it played. He had come in with the last rags of his old manner still on him, the lawyer beside him, the expensive carelessness in his clothes, a little of the old certainty that this, too, was a thing that would happen to him rather than something he had done. And I watched all of it leave him, frame by frame, as the room watched the gun and the climb and the order and the shove. By the time the sergeant's hand closed on his arm on the screen, the young man in the chair was not looking at the screen anymore. He was looking at the floor. He had finally, 3 weeks too late, found the off-ramp the guard had held open for him on the forecourt, and there was no taking it now. When it was his turn to speak, he did not bluster. That was the strangest part, and I have wondered since whether it was the truest thing he ever did. The lawyer said the careful lawyer things, a moment of poor judgment, a young man, no real harm done. But when the young man himself was asked finally to account for it, all the performance was gone and what was left was small and quiet and almost a boy. I thought he wouldn't do anything, he said. That was the whole I thought because he couldn't react. I could do anything I wanted to him. And he didn't do anything. He just stood there, and I thought that meant I'd won. He stopped. I see now that it meant the opposite. I will not pretend I felt sorry for him. I had watched him shove a man who had done nothing but stand where he was told to stand, and I do not believe a single soft word he said in that room would have ever left his mouth if 40 cameras had not made it impossible for him to lie. But I will say this. It was the only useful thing I ever saw money fail to buy. It could not buy him out of the room. It could not buy the cameras blind. It could not, in the end, buy back the 4 minutes in which he had shown the whole world exactly who he was when he thought no one with any power was watching, and learned, too late, that the man he had taken for furniture had been the most powerful one on the forecourt the entire time. The matter closed against him. He was charged with the assault, and he answered for it, not with the prison of a boy's revenge fantasy, but with something that I have come to think landed harder on a man like him. A public recorded undeniable record that he had done it, a penalty that his money paid without making it go away, and the permanent, searchable fact of those 4 minutes, which will outlive his little fame by years and which he can never again climb on top of. He had wanted to be seen forever. He got that too. The world simply chose for itself what it would remember him for. His following, the loud little crowd that had laughed before he finished his sentences, did to him exactly what his friends on the forecourt had done, melted backward the instant there was a cost to standing near him. The clips he had been so proud of, the other monuments, the other rules broken for the camera, were dug up and looked at again, and this time nobody laughed. A man who builds his name out of contempt for things better than himself should not be surprised when the wind changes and the name comes down. His did. And the guard. I went back later to the forecourt, twice in fact, though I have never told my grandson the second time was as much for me as for him. The gun is still there, The old bronze barrel gone green, the cracked oak quietly mended, the small worn plate telling its 300-year-old story to people who mostly walk past. And at the post, 6 feet away, stands a guard. I cannot tell you it was the same man. They look by design the same. That is the whole point of them, that you cannot pick the man out of the post, that the post is larger than any one of them and goes on whoever is standing in it. But I like to believe it was him, and I stood at the rope on a gray morning and watched him be exactly what he had been on the day I will never forget. Still, rooted, eyes forward, the wall that the moving world breaks against and does not move. A small boy near me asked his mother why the soldier didn't move, why he just stood there. What was the point of a man who only stood? And the mother, who had clearly seen the video like everyone else, crouched down and said something to the boy that I could not hear, and the boy looked up at the guard for a long time after that with a different kind of face than the one he had started with. And I thought, that is the point of him. That is the whole point. Not the bearskin and not the rifle and not the buttons. The point is that there are still men in the world who cannot be moved by a fool, who will not become the second clown in another man's act, who answer contempt not with contempt, but with the simple, unbreakable fact of doing their duty, and who, by standing still while the storm spends itself against them, teach a watching crowd more about strength than any blow ever could. The man climbed the gun because he thought the guard was furniture. He learned in front of everyone that the cannon was not a chair and the guard was not a statue, and that the stillest man on the forecourt had been, all along, the one with all the power. My grandson does not disbelieve me anymore when I tell him that the strongest thing a man can do is sometimes nothing at all. He saw it. He has the video. But mostly, he has the memory of a young man in a red tunic who was struck and did not strike back, who was mocked and did not answer, who stood his post through all of it, and then stepped quietly back into his square of stone with 2 smudges on his chest and his eyes forward, and won completely without ever once raising his hand. I worked stone for 40 years. I know what it is to be tested and to ring true. I have never seen anything ring truer than that.